So this is our Merleau Ponty reading group. We're continuing our reading of the structure of behavior. We are on chapter 2, picking up from page 88 of the translation. The last couple sessions, we've been going over his criticisms of other authors that sort of presuppose. Maybe to back up a little bit. Earlier, we looked at his criticisms of these very atomistic theories that start from something like an isolated sensation or an isolated stimulus, and then a response to that stimulus, and try to sort of reconstruct complex behavior in terms of these very simple stimulus response relationships. And then so we saw a few weeks ago his criticisms of why this doesn't work. Essentially, that it's just empirically incorrect. Like these stimulus response pairs don't actually exist if you sort of look at things more carefully. What he's looking at now in the last couple sessions that we've gone through is some of the ways that have been proposed of sort of overcoming this difficulty, and in particular this idea that you would have something like an integration. So this would be like there's still these sort of atomic sensations, like a sensation of red or a sensation of a particular tone or whatever. And then these get sort of brought together in some part of the brain that integrates things. So like you would compare, I don't know, the sound of red, or the sound of a bell and the smell of meat powder would get sort of integrated at some portion of the dog's brain, and that's like how they get connected to each other. Or one of the examples that he talks about is binocular vision. So the fact that when we look at an object using our two eyes, we see one object as opposed to two different images based on the two images that are projected on our two retinas. And so this theory would say that, like, so one of the sort of proposals that Merleau-Ponty discusses and criticizes is that there would be a kind of integration based on similarity. So like you would have one retinal image and another retinal image, and then like there's a certain similarity in between these images that makes your brain fuse the two images together. So you see one apple on the table and not two apples floating in front of your eyes. But what he points out here, or his argument here, is that this similarity is only present for us as the sort of external observer. We're sort of standing outside the perceptual situation. We can see we can observe the apple, and then we can observe the experimental subject looking at the apple, and then we can see that there's actually only one apple. But from the perspective of the perceiving subject themselves, so like internal to the perceptual situation, the similarity is exactly what you're trying to explain, right? Like you can't tell from within the perceptual situation that these two images are supposed to be similar, unless there's some way of there's some sort of external criterion to compare these images to. And he also points out in relation to an experiment, I forget who conducted this experiment, but that there's an experiment where you present a black piece of paper with white dots to one eye, and you present a white piece of paper with black dots to the other eye, and it turns out that the two images still fuse in the same way that the two images of the apple fuse, so that you end up seeing one dot, even though the dot on one eye is black and the dot on the other eye is white. So they have nothing in terms of perceptual quality in common. They're not similar in any way. But they, in terms of like the structure of perception, this figure-ground relationship, they play the same role. So they have the same function in our visual field. So what this shows is that it's not some sort of objective similarity between the contents, between the qualities of the two visual fields that is responsible for this fusion. It's something to do with a structure. And so this structure is something that it has to be there prior to the reception of individual sensations. So it's not the case that we first have a sensation of black on one eye and then a sensation of white on the other eye, and then somehow combine them. It's instead we have this figure ground structure is already there. The sensations are just sort of incorporated into this figure ground structure, and this structure is what brings about the perception of a single dot, even though the qualities of the two dots are opposite. And so this general notion of a sort of structure, like I mean, the title of the book is The Structure of Behavior, and in general, there's this notion of a structure that is not not built up from simple structureless parts. So he, in a few places we've already seen, and then later in the book as well, he's going to talk about this melodic perception, or this the sort of model for what perception is like is this melodic is the perception of a melody. And so like this was one of the sort of key examples for Gestalt psychology. So when you hear a melody that you recognize, you recognize the melody as a whole structure, and you can recognize the same melody even when the melody is transposed and it might not have any single note in common. But the structure, the sequence of ascending and descending intervals is common, even though the individual notes are different. And so it's this kind of structured whole, this articulated structure. So it's a structure that is like it's a perception of something that has a structure that is prior to the elements that go into that structure. So this is sort of what for Merleau-Ponty is like the model of perception, as opposed to starting from these very simple structureless sensations and then sort of putting them together in some way. And then in particular, this will apply to perception of behavior in humans or other animals. So when you perceive the behavior of a rat navigating a maze, for example, you're not just sort of seeing these individual, very simple stimulus response pairs. You're seeing the behavior of an organism adapting to its environment, and even something as simple as like walking, for example, requires a structured sequence of movements so that the movements of each leg are coordinated with those of the opposite side, to produce this sort of rhythmic or melodic structure of behavior, as opposed to just this very simple stimulus response pairing of one set of muscles and another set of muscles. So this is going to be sort of the model that we use for understanding behavior in general. It has this, I hesitate to use the word holistic here because that has sort of like a vague, I don't know, kind of a new age vibe to it. But like, yeah, the idea is that the structure is prior to the elements that make up the structure, or the elements that enter into that structure. And so this is how we want to sort of understand behavior in general, is in terms of these structures, and not in terms of these unstructured atoms that would then sort of be combined together in some way. So I think that might be a good place to start, if I can just find the right page again. Right, okay. So if someone can read from page 88, halfway down the page at negatively, the conclusion is easy.
I can read. Negatively, the conclusion is easy. Pavlov's conceptions are irreconcilable with modern pathology and physiology. If their inadequacy appeared already at the level where we have most often placed ourselves, it would be even more apparent in a complete analysis of perception. I do not perceive simply quote-unquote things, but also use objects. An article of clothing, for example. Between the actual appearance of the article of clothing placed in front of me, the position which it can occupy in space, for example, were I to take it and put it behind me in order to put it on, and the right and left regions of my own body, a series of regulated correspondence is established which permits the normal person to handle the article of clothing without hesitation, and which is lacking in a person suffering from agnosia. Nerve functioning distributes not only spatial and chromatic values, but also symbolic values. The conditioned reflex theory obliges us to treat these systematic transformations as a sum of local transformations, explicable in each point of the cortex by the conditioned efficacy of the stimuli. Suppose I am looking at a coat placed in front of me. For me to take it and put it on, the left sleeve, which is first situated at my right, passes to my left. It is my left arm which I must introduce into it. The correlation which is manifest in my behavior between what was on the right, quote, what was on the right, unquote, and quote, what will be on the left, quote, would find its explanation according to the conditioned reflex theory in the reflexogenic power acquired by each partial stimulus in the course of experience. But now, when I am actually perceiving the sleeve of the coat, the index, quote, on the right, quote, with which it is marked cannot come from conditionings acquired by the points of the retina then stimulated. These conditionings are indeed multiple, since a single retinal impression, depending on the position of the eyes, has been able to correspond to stimuli which are situated in an extremely variable way in objective space. Only the proprioceptive excitations, which represent the current position of my eyes to the central system, can choose, among the conditionings acquired by retinal impression, the one which will be evoked in each case. This comes down to saying that the situation perceived according to right and left, far from depending on the retinal stimulus as such, depends on a constellation of proprioceptive and exteroceptive stimuli. Once again, the excitation, instead of being a longitudinal and punctual phenomenon, a transverse and global phenomenon, but an adapted behavior demands something more. Each point of the concrete expanse currently seen must possess not only a present localization, but also a series of virtual localizations, which will situate it with respect to my body when my body moves. In such a way, for example, that I thrust my left arm without hesitation in the sleeve which was on my right when the coat was placed in front of me. In other words, it would not be sufficient that fragments of concrete expanse, circumscribed by the limits of my visual field, and each one of which would have a spatial structure of its own, appear one after the other in the course of movements. It is necessary that each point of one of these perspectives be put in correspondence and identified with those which represent it in the others. It is even less possible that in the first case for these new spatial indices than in the first case for these new spatial indices to result only from retinal excitations and from the conditioned reactions which they would have released. Yeah, so the reflex arc theory can explain like putting on a coat and seeing the sleeve that is now visibly on my right, which is going to be on my left after this set of movements, which are sort of virtually already included in the visual position of the coat as I see it now. And it just doesn't make sense to try to explain, to try to add up these punctual, like visual moments through which the sleeve on my right ends up on my left. There has to be something connecting them, and it seems to be a kind of attunement to the structure of the situation as a whole that can't be explained by the atomistic theory.
Yeah, so this maybe it would help here to add like a second example. So we have the coat example, like you have a coat hanging on a hanger in front of you, and in this case you have to see something on the left side of your visual field and know that your right hand has to sort of, or your right arm has to sort of correspond to that left side of the visual field. But in a different situation, if you have like I don't know, different objects in front of you on a table, and you want to reach for one that's on the left, you will use your left arm to do it. So in this situation, you have to know that, or you understand that you can grasp the object on your left using your left arm. You don't reach for it with your right arm. So here we see like just the contrast between these two different situations shows that our sort of stimulus response pairing, if you want to use that terminology, is not just sort of built up from these simple relationships between one region of the visual field on the stimulus side and then a certain response on the other side, because depending on the type of situation and what the sort of manipulation of the object in question is that we want to perform, or that we sort of know we should perform, then the pairing is different in the two cases. Either you use your left hand or your right hand, depending on what type of object it is. And so you could of course always sort of argue that there's like, again, the sort of integration or connection of these different things. So like first you would have some set of sensations in your visual fields on the left side, and then you would have some sort of process of recognition that would bring about the acknowledgement that this set of visual stimuli in front of me is a depiction of a coat, or is sort of the representative of a coat, and then you would have some sort of like unconscious inference process that says, okay, if I want to put this coat on, then I need to move my right arm to put it in the left sleeve. So this is one way you could it's still open, like it's not sort of, this idea is not refuted at this point. But the sort of alternative picture that Merleau-Ponty is presenting to us is that we don't have to do this whole sort of process of unconscious inference and comparison and so on. That we actually, like, our perception of something as a coat is already a sort of recognition of how it relates to my the left-right differentiation of my body. So like perceiving something as a coat is already knowing or perceiving it as something that I have to sort of reverse the orientation of when I want to put it on. And sort of more generally, the idea here, I think, is that our perception is always related to the types of manipulation and use of the objects that we that we envision when we perceive these objects. So it's not the case that we first have these sensations and then we recognize what type of object it is, and then we sort of think about or infer how I would have to manipulate it to bring about a certain goal. Instead, it's the whole relationship between the use of the object and my bodily manipulation of that object that structures my perception of the object as a certain kind of object in the first place. So it's again sort of exactly, it's the idea that you have to process the coat recognition through a sort of decision tree that, like, if X is a coat, then manipulate X in manner Y. Exactly. So you have to, like, the grasp of something as a coat already sort of implies in this sort of implicit way, it implies this recognition that a coat is something you put on, and putting on a coat involves using your right arm to go into the left sleeve and vice versa. So this function or this use of a coat, that a coat is something you can put on. This is like the normal way of manipulating a coat, or at least one of the normal ways. And then secondly, that putting on task is something that you have to do using the sort of reverse arm orientation. So these two sort of elements make up our grasp of something as a coat. If you are incapable of performing these two sort of functions, then you have a deficient perception of something as a coat. And so he points to these agnosia cases. So there are people who suffer brain damage through a stroke or injury of some kind, who are incapable of recognizing an object in this way. So like they can describe, I see a sort of colored patch of this shape in this part of my visual field. They can sort of describe things in that sense. But like when you ask them, like, okay, pick up, like, perform the task that is associated with this object, do something with this object, they find themselves sort of at a loss. They don't know what to do in relation to the object. And so what he is proposing here is that the like in the subjects who are not injured in this way, this whole sort of recognition of what the object is and of how I can use the object are bound together, or are really just one process that we can sort of divide into two elements only in thought and not in reality. Whereas in the case of the injured patients who have this kind of brain damage, this agnosia patients, they are incapable of performing one of the essential elements of this process, of this task of recognition. And so because of that, they're incapable of recognizing what these objects are. It's a kind of reversal of perspective on a perceptual situation, rather than starting from like these very simple elements and then sort of building them up into recognition of a kind of object, and then, like, on the basis of that recognition, then figuring out what you can do with that kind of object. You instead start from the actions, these bodily actions and manipulations of the object as inherent in the recognition of what that kind of object is. So it's again this like our already this sort of very basic structure of our bodily relationship to objects. This left-right structure is sort of present as part of our capacity for perceiving objects in the first place. It's not something that is sort of added on later through integration or comparison of simple atomic sensations.
Yeah, can I add something too? To the part between where he makes the difference between the excitation and then adapted behavior. I think there is this two-layer structure, and when we move from one layer to another, there is this qualitative difference in Merleau-Ponty. I mean, he remarks there that it's an excitation, that there's this phenomenon which is global and transferred in the visual system. But this visual system, when we are talking about behavior, and when in an experiment we are kind of trying to measure or understand a behavior, it's not just a visual system that we're talking about here. Yeah, sure, there's a structure inherent in the visual system as well. When there's this stimuli coming, it's not just a punctual phenomenon. It's just not something that is free of form. And we can talk about that too. But what we are mostly interested in this adaptive behavior, and it has horizons that are opening to other systems that we have, whether it is perceptual or something else. And I think that's an interesting difference here too.
Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, like our visual perception of the coat is already a kind of anticipation of what, like, say, the texture of the coat would be if I touched it, or like you perceive the coat visually, and then if you sort of reach out to it and find that it's like 10 times heavier than it looks, that you would be very surprised. Like you already anticipate, how heavy this object is, how it will, like, you can see looking at the coat that it's a kind of flexible substance and not like a sort of rigid piece of metal or something. Like if you picked up the coat and it didn't bend and flex in the way that you anticipate, you would be very surprised. So yeah, like already in our visual perception, there's this anticipation of what other sense modalities would experience in relation to it and how it can be manipulated. So yeah, it's a sort of future oriented, like our visual perception, or any other form of perception is already future oriented in sort of pointing towards other sense modalities and other possibilities for manipulation of the object. And so if those anticipations turn out to be incorrect, you have this, like, I don't know, this you see a code in front of you, and then as you sort of get closer, you realize it's actually a cardboard cutout or something. Like you're surprised and confused in that situation, as opposed to the normal situation where all of the perceptions sort of accord with the anticipations. So yeah, it's this is another element of the structure another aspect of this structural form of perception and behavior. So everything has this sort of, again, we don't have these sort of moments that are disconnected from each other and then integrate those moments together. We have this sort of pre-existing structure into which those moments enter, that sort of brings about our perceptual grasp of an object as a coat or as any other kind of object. And then ultimately, like this kind of sort of anticipatory nature of perception, you can connect this with just the sort of basic function of a living being of responding to the environment in an adaptive way. That you have to, any living being has to find the opportunities in its environment for nutrition, mating, shelter, all these things. And then it also has to protect itself against dangers in its environment, weather, predators, anything like that. So these are all sort of basic functions of what it is to be a living being. So like even just from a basic biological perspective, there's no value in just sort of recognizing in this sort of very static way that like this is a code. What is valuable is recognizing what can I do with this thing in front of me, and then like the sort of categorization or like using a word code or a concept of code to categorize that object is only sort of relevant insofar as it helps me to adapt to my environment and either put on the code or do other things with the code that are useful for my general sort of life project, my existence as a biological entity. And yeah, the same thing would apply in obviously in different ways to a rat navigating a maze or a dog trying to find food or whatever. Any other organism also has to perceive what the environment offers to it in terms of opportunities and dangers, and then respond to those opportunities and dangers in an appropriate way. And so that's what like this whole perception behavior system is essentially the organism's means of responding to the environment in an adaptive way.
Yeah, what you said kind of reminded me of one of Merleau-Ponty's quotes, I think, carving up a question. And it relates a lot with Merleau-Ponty's other words he constantly used, such as constellation and arc. Like, there is this project, sure, but it's not just mental. There is this project towards their environment, but it's just not mental. And that it kind of carves itself up with the things the milieu, the surroundings also afford you, and then maybe makes your question kind of relevant too. In a place that is completely devoid of food or any resource, you would have that need, but you would not really kind of dare to come up with it. And then what makes sense and what makes things relevant or not, and your kind of intentions kind of feed themselves up from the milieu too. So the meaning is kind of a constellation between the two poles.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like these terms like structure, constellation, he uses a few different or there's melodic perception, like all of these terms are all suggesting a kind of a structure that is articulated, so it's not just sort of a vague, whole. It's not just everything all sort of combined into a soup or something. It has components that are related to each other in specific ways, but at the same time, those components are sort of secondary to the structure itself. It's only in relation to that structure that the components can actually play a certain role. So he uses these different terms for, I think, the same or like related ideas. So even something that seems very like abstract and intellectual, meditating on the nature of being or whatever, this is in some respects still connected to that relationship with the milieu, with the what the environment around me offers in terms of opportunities and dangers. Like even at a sort of very basic level, that if you're starving, you're probably not like thinking about the nature of being. You're probably trying to find food. Just having the fact that your sort of basic biological needs are met in a somewhat adequate way is like a precondition for other kinds of inquiry that are maybe less directly tied to those biological needs, but are still sort of founded on them in some way. Yeah, and exactly, yeah. So there would be different environments that would produce different inquiries. So like this is a sort of one of Heidegger's main points in Being and Time is that like you use a tool to bring about a certain effect. Like you use a tool for something, hammering a nail or whatever, and you don't really think about it as long as things are working properly. But then you but then maybe the hammer is maybe not a great example because they're normally pretty indestructible. But some tool that it's damaged or it's not working the way that you expect, suddenly this tool becomes something obvious to me. That's something that I have to think about and deal with in a way that I didn't before. The different environments sort of encourage different kinds of inquiry. It's depending on what is available to you in that environment, you might be more likely or less likely to think about certain things or to respond to the environment in certain ways and so on. Just waiting for a couple messages in the chat here before we move on. Yeah, so yeah, with Heidegger, it's an interesting question about like the relationship between this Heideggerian notion of the tool use and Merleau-Ponty's understanding here. I'm not actually sure to what extent Merleau-Ponty had read Heidegger at this point. This was only like 5 or 6 years after Being and Time came out, although he could read German, so it's possible that he had already read it. Yeah, here it's definitely much more biological and sort of corporeal, and as opposed to Heidegger. For Heidegger, there's the being of a tool like a hammer is understood in relation to this web of involvements of a hammer is something that's for hammering, and hammering nails is something that's for building a house, for example. It's like this whole network of the for which everything has a sort of function to in relation to which it is that kind of equipment, and these are all sort of connected to each other in this very complicated network. And in Being and Time, there's not a lot of, or hardly any actually, discussion of how that relates to our sort of biological existence or corporeal existence as living beings. It's much more I guess in terms of like the spiritual, if you want to use that term, this like capacity of human beings to understand the environment, as opposed to the sort of biological needs and adaptations. And there's only a very, I think, like one line where he talks about other animals' relation to being as a kind of derivative form of understanding. That's like, you have to understand Dasein first, and then on the basis of Dasein, you can understand animal existence as a kind of derivative form, or like a deficient form. So yeah, for Merleau-Ponty, it's a little bit poor in worlds is his term. So yeah, for Merleau-Ponty, it's a bit different because he's doing a kind of critical analysis of physiology and psychology. So he's very engaged with the empirical literature about other animals and humans in a way that Heidegger definitely is not. So he's like approaching the question from a very different angle. But I think he arrives at similar ideas, though obviously not quite the same.
Yeah, that's one of the things I'm most interested in following the course of the argument in this book, is it seems like he starts with contemporary, physiological and naturalistic theories, and kind of finds his way to a transcendental position. I think that, not like a Kantian transcendental position, but a kind of transcendental position nonetheless. And I think that we kind of already see, like, in this emphasis on perception being kind of already structured. I think he may have suggested this already, but if this is the case, then obviously it applies to the researcher studying physiology as well. There's this. We start with this physiological theory, but Merleau-Ponty sort of follows through on some of the consequences, and I think that you end up with this reflexive effect of some of the discoveries from following through on those consequences, which has implications for the way that we approach even a more naturalistic and physiological account. Like, if it's the case that everything is already structured in this way, then you can't then step outside of that in order to kind of like look around it and see how things are in themselves, or at least you would have to find a way to justify saying you could do that.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. This reflexivity of the theory, or the way that this theory sort of applies to itself. He mentioned, I forget exactly where, but we talked about this a few sessions ago, where he talked about how the Pavlov's theory, or any of these other very simple reflex accounts, they sort of present themselves as being purely empirical, as like just observing phenomena and recording what they observed, and then sort of integrating that into a theory. But he points out that this is like sort of an illusion, because they're already presupposing a kind of account of what physiological theory is in the first place, of like, they're already presupposing this stimulus response structure. And the question is not like, can we look at the facts independent of any theory and then compare them with the theory and see if they're correct or if our theory is correct or not? Because that's sort of an illusion. What we instead have to do is we can only gather facts and conduct empirical research in relation to a theory and in relation to some sort of understanding of what it is we're doing, and then so we can't sort of step outside of any theory and then compare our theory with the facts independent of any theory. But that of course doesn't mean that like all theories are sort of equally good or like each theory is correct in its own way or something like that. Because you can do this sort of internal criticism of theories like he's doing in this book. You can take a theory as it exists and sort of try to figure out to what extent it realizes its own ambitions. Is it actually capable of explaining things the way that it claims to be doing? So by doing this kind of criticism that he's doing in this book, you can take a theory as it exists and show its deficiencies and show how it leads us to another kind of theory. So we never actually sort of step outside of understanding of the world and of what a physiological theory is. We never sort of exist outside of theory altogether and then compare the theory with the facts. It's always within a certain theory, but we are capable of criticizing those theories and progressing from one less adequate theory to another more adequate theory. Yeah, until we end with absolute knowing. There are some, I think, in the phenomenology of perception, there's some sort of reflection on the extent to which we end up with something like a final theory, if I remember correctly. But it's been a while since I read that part of the book, so I'm not sure. It might be somewhere else actually, but so like he obviously is not doing the same thing as Hegel, so we're not going to sort of arrive at a sort of final theory or final account of the world that is adequate in every way. Instead it's a kind of process of internal development of theories that are more and more adequate in various ways, but there's always new things to understand, new developments in art and science and other aspects of our relationship to the world that are always changing as we try to understand them. And then maybe the last thing before we move on here is a comment from Odd Individual that we sort of skipped over in talking about some other things. But this idea that you can sometimes these maybe intellectual or other kinds of needs might sort of override bodily needs. And so the example here is being in love and then not being able to eat or sleep or something like that. So this is a good example, and this is something related to this, I guess, is maybe what Heidegger talks about when he talks about space in relation to Dasein, in that space for Dasein is always connected with something like a project or some sort of orientation towards the world. It's not just like a set of coordinates and distances. So like you might be closer to your partner in sort of affective space, even if they're very far away from you in physical distance. You might be like, you can think of, say, like you're on a video call with your partner who is in a different city, a different country even. You might sort of affectively be very close to them and then completely distant to all the objects that are physically quite close to you. So there's like a different sort of relationship to space that occurs at maybe an affective level. Again, this is something that could be sort of disordered in the case of brain damage or psychological disorders of various kinds, where you might for example, lose any connection to the objects that are physically near you and just be in sort of your own worlds and thinking about the Eiffel Tower or whatever other distant object at all times and not even really recognize what's happening around you. Obviously, this is sort of a pathological phenomenon as opposed to the more sort of normal case where we have this like flexible interaction of what's distant from us but affectively important, and then what's physically close to us, even if it's not something we care about. Like part of what it is to grasp objects and perceive them in an appropriate way is to be able to sort of move between like these different levels of relationship to them, an affective relationship, a sort of basic perceptual relationship, and all these other ways that you can grasp an object. So you have to, like, maybe the coat in front of you is like something that is very affectively important. It's like, I don't know, your grandfather's coat that's been passed down for generations, and you treat it with care and so on. Or maybe it's just like something you bought for $3 at a thrift store and you don't really care about it. So it could have very different sort of affective qualities, but this is part of what you grasp when you grasp it as a coat, as either something to be treated with care or as something to be discarded. Yeah, and in relation to that, so like, what is the relationship between these different ways of grasping an object or an entity in general? Like, one way of saying, or one way of understanding this, maybe the more sort of common sense way, would be to say that we first sort of have a perception and recognition that this object is a coat, or that it's my coat even, and then secondarily we have some sort of valuation applied to it, or affective evaluation of the object. So first I say this is my coat, and then I say, oh yes, this is my grandfather's coat that I value and treasure and want to treat with care. So that's like secondary element that's sort of projected onto the object. I mean, we haven't really seen anything on this topic yet in this book, but in general, Merleau Ponty is going to criticize this kind of account. Like, it's antithetical to the kind of account that we've seen in the book so far. Instead, he would have to say something like, my grasp of this object as like my recognition that this is my grandfather's coat that I care a lot about, is partly constituted by the fact that I treat it as an object that that is to be treated with care. Like, it's like this bodily response of picking it up carefully and so on. All these bodily interactions with the object are part of what it means to grasp it as something to be treated with care. And this is not something that sort of is applied secondarily to the object after I recognize what it is. They're all sort of part of the same grasp of the object. But yeah, that's a little bit outside of what we've actually read so far in the book here. But I think that's a pretty straightforward kind of extrapolation from what we've seen. Again, it's always this refusal of the idea of like separating out the intellectual side from the corporeal side as like two distinct things, and then the intellectual would be sort of secondary, like posterior in time to the sort of basic corporeal grasp. So that's sort of like the general theoretical move he wants to make, is to see these as like integrated with each other as part of this sort of indissoluble unity of corporeal and psychological in perception and behavior. Okay, so we can jump back into the text after that. A bit of a digression, but I think a good one. So could someone pick up from the bottom of 89 at the reasoning processes?
I can read. Okay. The reasoning processes which we have just gone through with respect to each of the spatial perspectives is a fortiori valid with respect to their integration in a space. Thus, the apparent position and its virtual variations must be a function of two variables: the afferent ocular excitations and, on the other hand, the ensemble of excitations which represent the current positions of my body in the cerebral cortex. A reorganization of the spatial field will correspond to its change of this position. If, for example, I execute half a turn, what was, quote-unquote, on the right will be immediately marked with the index, quote-unquote, on the left, and identified in this new position. It follows from this that neither for physiology nor for psychology can the spatial field of behavior be constructed point for point. Each quote-unquote local sign depends on a global process of excitation in which participate, in addition to the retinal excitations, those which come from the oculomotor muscles, the devices of equilibrium, and the ensemble of the muscles of the body. Each perceived position has a meaning only as integrated into a framework of space, which includes not only a sensible sector, actually perceived, but also a quote-unquote virtual space, of which the sensible sector is only a momentary aspect. It is in this way that the perceiving subject can move himself in a stable space, in spite of the movements of the eyes and body, which use all the punctual excitations at the surface of the receptor at each instant. The condition reflex theory, in addition to the fact that it would suppose a long and difficult learning period and accords badly with the precocity of our adaptations to space, explains nothing since, in any case, the acquired conditioning will have to be put into play by a process of structure excitation, which renders the hypothesis superfluous. If pathology and physiology exclude physiological empiricism, the thesis according to which the functional structures realized by nerve activity would be reducible to the association by contiguity created in the course of experience, they are by the same token unfavorable to a dualism of perception and sensation, of form and matter. The cerebral regions assigned to elementary vision represent only way stations. We have no right to set up a correspondence between them and a first level of behavior or a first layer of quote-unquote mental facts. Disorders such as musical deafness or amusia manifest the existence in normal persons of functions of auditive organization analogous to the distribution of chromatic and spatial values in the visual order. But if it is impossible to constitute the spatial field of behavior or that of perception from quote-unquote localizing reflexes or from punctual local signs, neither is it permissible to refer the organization to a higher system. There are agnosias which destroy the virtual space of which we spoke without compromising the spatial structures within the visual field. They may modify them, but nevertheless they do not make them impossible. Concrete space, as it is grasped within our visual field, and virtual space, in which concrete space is integrated in normal perception, are two distinct constitutive layers, even though the second integrates the first. We can be disoriented in virtual space without being so in concrete space. We can be incapable of conceptualizing space as a universal milieu without the horizon of virtual space which surrounds the properly visible expanse being abolished at the same time. The notion of form has value precisely because it goes beyond the atomistic conception of nerve functioning, without reducing it to a diffuse and undifferentiated activity. Because it rejects psychological empiricism without going to the intellectual antithesis. The analysis of perception will lead to re-establishing a demarcation no longer between sensation and perception, or between sensibility and intelligence, or, more generally, between a chaos of elements and a higher system which will organize them, but between different types or levels of organization. Do I keep going on? Or?
Sorry, I was a little bit distracted by adding the Kant emoji that I just requested. Yeah, maybe we can stop here. So again, this is sort of more or less a summary of what we've seen so far, and maybe this notion of virtual space is something that's new. It's not 100% clear at this point, I think, what exactly he means by this virtual space, but we can think of like one instance. One instance here. I'm not sure if this is exactly what he means by virtual space, but this example when he talks about how you can, for example, you can perceive the world as stable, even though as you're walking down the street, for example, your eyes are constantly moving, your head is sort of bouncing in relation to your body as you take each step. So like the pattern of sensations in of visual sensations of like what colors are being projected onto each retina at every moment is constantly changing. But at the same time, you don't perceive like a world sort of bouncing and moving around all the time. You perceive the world like the buildings and parked cars and everything are all sort of stable, and you perceive yourself as moving through this world that is stable. So like your experience of the world in space has to be structured in such a way that you sort of situate your perceptual the stimuli that you receive. You have to situate those stimuli in relation to your prior understanding of space, as opposed to taking these stimuli and sort of somehow extracting space from them, because you just like very simply, like the stimuli are constantly changing, but you are you recognize these stimuli as, or you situate these stimuli in relation to a stable space. So this is already like a kind of not exactly a refutation of the sort of associationist or bottom up approach, but it shows that what has to be explained by that theory is much more complicated than just like this situating one perception to the left of the other or whatever. You have to sort of figure out how you can take these constantly changing stimuli and grasp them as perceptions of unchanging or stable objects in spatial relation to each other.
About this different types of levels of organization, I think, and also about in the virtual space, I think kind of conceptualizing as having a motor project on mind, maybe using that term, could help, because a motor project is something that you are kind of trying to do, and at the basis level you are trying to function, and what that means in language is kind of a success word. It implies achievement. Like when you function, it means you function correctly. So all these little movements that your body does autonomously and that you're not aware of, but is kind of serving a purpose, that is kind of a different level of organization. So I think that is what is implied here. And then when you look to the experiments, and then you try to measure these movements and try to kind of isolate them, I think that's one of the mistakes there that Merleau-Ponty criticizes. Like, your head is stabilized and your eyes are kind of stabilized as well, etc. So you are trying to measure a phenomenon that requires all these different movements that you already do. So they are not kind of that they are not kind of making your attention go to different places, but they are actually concentrating you on the single project. And I think, just as a final note, to look at the development of a child is kind of could be beneficial here, because at first these movements are not really organized well. We can't really keep our head up. Like, focus is kind of different than the adult focus and stuff. And in psychoanalysis, they say that Bion or Melanie Klein and stuff, they say that the mother is the one that organizes the behavior for the baby, and then structures the world for the baby, because the baby does not yet have a developed, well adapted motor project for the world of the adults. So the mother kind of introduces, or the whatever the figure is, kind of introduces this organizing element, and then makes baby to be more expressive with their movements. So it organizes the desires, or organizes the already going on flow into understandable expressions. And then later on the baby kind of adapts this themselves. So this is the development to a motor project, and I think that kind of makes us understand what we do with these little movements that are constantly on play, and yet are able to have a stable foundation to do anything else as well.
Yeah, thanks. So he does mention here development very briefly. So he said the conditioned reflex theory, in addition to the fact that it would suppose a long and difficult learning period and accords badly with the precocity of our adaptations to space, etc. So he mentions that when we observe the development of human infants, it doesn't, like, there's nothing in that process of a human infant coming to learn how to engage with the world that seems like this sort of associationist learning process. So like as you mentioned, like very young infants, they're incapable of holding their head up in terms of like muscular development. But part of that process of development of the infant involves strengthening those muscles in the neck, but also sort of learning that keeping your head stable is an important aspect of being able to perceive the world in the appropriate way. Like if you couldn't hold your head up, it would be hard to like keep your eyes fixated on a particular object. And so so like you have to learn through experience, through trying to fixate objects and failing, and then figuring out how to do it better, that you have to hold your head stable. And so this is like a perceptual learning process, but it's very different than something like associating one stimulus to another stimulus in this conditioned reflex or conditioned response theory. It's not this sort of passive association of things that happen to be found together often. It's a much more active learning process of trying to do something, trying to adapt to the world and achieve certain goals, and failing and then learning how to do it better. And then like you can see already with like from a pretty young age, infants will start to manipulate objects. They pick up the ball or the truck or whatever and start they put it in their mouths. They shake it to see what happens. Like they just sort of do things with objects. It seems like this is sort of the way that you learn how to perceive the world is partly through manipulating it and like seeing what happens. Kids love knocking things over and pulling things and getting into trouble because that's how they learn how things respond. And sometimes it has negative consequences. If you like poke the dog's eye or something, that probably would not turn out well. But you learn from the negative experiences, and then you figure out how to avoid them, and you learn from the positive experiences that this is if I perform this kind of action, then I get the result that I want. That already from a very early age, there's a relationship between perception and manipulation of objects to bring about a certain desired state of the world. And so this is a very different way of explaining development compared to this associationist way that would be this sort of passive reception of stimuli, and then when they happen to be found in conjunction with each other, there would be this association would develop. It's a much more active and exploratory account of development compared to an associationist account. And the bit about psychoanalysis here is interesting as well because, or like this relation to the mother or whatever figure plays the role of the mother, because it connects with what we were talking about earlier about like the affective space. Like the young infants will, for example, want to be close to the parent or some trusted figure, and their relationship to space is going to be structured by where is the parent in relation to me. So like if they're in maybe in their own home, they might be able to sort of wander around a little bit and have a little bit of independence from the parent, but then in an unfamiliar surrounding, they might stick much more close to the parent. And so like their capacity to explore space or their willingness to explore space is in part derived or is related to the relationship with the parent and what their affective state is, whether they're afraid or happy or whatever. All these things are sort of bound together, and your relationship to space is already structured by your relationship to a parent or some sort of trusted figure that provides a sort of center of space for you, that this is like the safe part of space that I can stay in, and then I can venture out if I'm feeling confident, and then if I'm afraid, I'll go back to the safe part of space. Okay, I think we can go on to the next bit. Sorry, let me just find where we are again. Yeah, so page 91, someone could pick up from concerning the relations.
I can read. Concerning the relations of behavior and the brain, the preceding analysis can have two meanings. Perhaps they require only changing categories and introducing the notion of form in physiology. Form, in the sense in which we have defined it, possesses original properties with regard to those of the parts which can be detached from it. Each movement is determined by the grouping of the other movements, and their respective value depends on a state of total equilibrium, the formula of which is an intrinsic character of form. In this sense, it seems to fulfill all the conditions necessary for giving an account of nerve functioning. Thus, it would be possible to define it as a process of the code figure and ground and code type. With regard to the dependence of forms in relation to certain topographical conditions, all degrees exist, from the case of a membrane stretched over a metallic frame and submitted to pressures in relation to which it realizes a certain position of equilibrium, to the case of a drop of oil in water which realizes a stable structure without any topographical support. Again, in this sense, form appears capable of explaining the ambiguity of place in nerve substance, from the horizontal localizations of the periphery to the vertical localizations of the center. These uncontested localizations represent points of the cortex where the essential processes unfold the code figure of the total process without our ever being able to separate them completely from a ground, which is constituted by the activity of the rest of the cortex. Thus, on the condition that quote-unquote form is introduced in nerve functioning, a parallelism or a rigorous quote-unquote isomorphism could be maintained. But the very fact that we had to borrow the terms figure and ground from the phenomenal or perceived world in order to describe these quote-unquote physiological forms unquote, just as above with the metaphor of melody, leads us to wonder if these are still physiological phenomena, if we can in principle conceive of processes which are still physiological and which would adequately symbolize relations inherent in what is ordinarily called quote-unquote consciousness. We have seen, for example, that two disparate excitations are fused in vision if they fulfill the same function in the two colored surfaces, be it only that of dot on a homogeneous ground. But how can it be understood that this community of function can be the cause which makes them fuse? Should I stop here?
Actually, you can go on to finish this section on the next page.
Okay. The function dot on a homogeneous ground or more generally, the function figure and ground has a meaning only in the perceived world. It is there that we learn what it is to be a figure and what it is to be a ground. The perceived will be explicable only by the perceived itself, and not by physiological processes. A physiological analysis of perception would be purely and simply impossible. On the basis of a word as a physical phenomenon, as an ensemble of vibrations of the air, no physiological phenomenon capable of serving as a substrate for the signification of the word could be described in the brain. For we have seen that in audition and also in speaking, a word as an ensemble of motor or afferent excitations presupposes a word as a melodic structure, and this later presupposes a sentence as a unity of signification. As one moves toward the center of the cortex, the conditions of behavior, instead of being found in the nerve substance as such, as may happen on the periphery, are more and more to be found in the qualitatively variable modes of its global functioning. A logical hierarchy of functional levels is substituted for the spatial juxtaposition of the peripheral conductors, and, in case of lesion, disorders of structure are substituted for deficiencies of contents. Since the structure of behavior and the cerebral functioning which supports it can only be conceived in terms borrowed from the perceived world, this latter no longer appears as an order of phenomena parallel to the order of physiological phenomena, but as one which is richer than it. Physiology cannot be completely conceptualized without borrowing from psychology. And, in the final analysis, what does the failure of a physiology of space perception signify? It signifies that a model of space as perception reveals it cannot be constructed either in real space or in mental facts by an assemblage of parts, or it signifies, as Kant had said, that real extension, parts extra parts, presupposes known extension. Thus it is to the ideality of space to which these simple remarks would lead. It will be possible to establish the conclusions only after a stricter analysis of the notion of form.
Right. Thanks. Yeah. So this is sort of the overall message of what we've read so far in this book. I think this idea that form. So we have sort of two stages of this analysis in relation to form in perception. So the first stage would just see that these bottom-up approaches to physiology of perception don't work. So you can't start from atomic sensations and then combine them and sort of build up complex structures from there. And then you would conclude from that that there's this notion of that even in the physiology of perception, you have to make use of the figure-ground relationship and other sort of forms or structures in the sense that we've been talking about earlier. And so this is sort of the position of the Gestalt psychologist. So you in our experimental physiological analysis of perception, we already have to make use of these form concepts like figure and ground. But what Merleau-Ponty here is arguing is that by making use of concepts like figure and ground, we're already sort of going beyond a purely physiological argument or theory altogether. Like a figure ground relationship is always inherently a perceived relationship. It's not like if you conduct a purely physiological analysis of the world, there's nothing that is a figure or a ground. There's only what some organism treats as a figure or a ground in its perceptual behavioral relation with the world. So from this sort of realistic point of view, this scientific point of view, the world is not sort of structured into figure and ground. And so if you start using these notions like figure and ground, then you're already going beyond this purely realistic approach to studying the world. And so we have to sort of recognize that that's what we're doing. We can't sort of import these notions of these psychological notions like figure and ground into physiology without recognizing a sort of priority of the psychological over the physiological. So this is what he sort of concludes with in that last bit about space, but this applies to any other of these structures that he's been talking about. So like we can't start from space as understood realistically as that in which entities are spatially related to each other as a physical set of coordinates, for example, and then from there sort of apply this figure ground relationship onto it. We have to start from perceived space, which is already structured in terms of figure and ground, and all these other spatial structures that we've been talking about, left versus right and so on. We have to start from that perceived space, and we can understand the real space of a scientific grasp of the world in this set of coordinates. We can understand this as something that is sort of constructed from this perceived space, by use of measuring instruments, for example. It's a sort of much more abstract and intellectual relationship to space than the sort of primary relationship to space. So again, it's a sort of change of direction of how we approach whatever it is we're studying. So now we have to start from the perceived world first, the world as we experience it in our engagement with the world as something that offers opportunities and dangers. And in that engagement with the world, we sometimes do things like measuring objects in relation to coordinates, and that brings about a grasp of space in terms of this sort of abstract structure of coordinates, but that's something secondary to the original grasp of space in terms of perception. Yeah, Angus, do you want to maybe talk about your comment here in the chat over voice? I think it's an important one.
Yeah, I'm still kind of struggling to find a way to articulate this, but if once you open up, once you reach this point that Merleau-Ponty says that he's brought us to, where you can't analyze perception, for instance, on merely physiological grounds, but you have to open it up to this idea from perception itself, from the experience of perception, which is the figure and ground distinction. Then it seems to me that there's no reason to stop at the psychology as opposed to the physiology of perception, because you're not going to have any moment of pure psychological perception in which you simply perceive a figure against a ground, even if you're doing this in like a laboratory setting as part of some kind of psychological study. You are a person, a life in a social situation that's organized in a certain way with economic structure and various conceptual habituations that you're bringing to bear to the situation as well. And it just seems like all of that would brought into. I just don't know how. I don't really draw the line cleanly at psychology. I'm not saying he necessarily, but he doesn't. As 61 says, he kind of bears the implications. Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's a problem at all. I think it's great.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I think in this book at least he's going to stick with the psychological level, but I think he does in other texts go on to explore some of these sort of consequences of this open-endedness of perception, I guess, or open-endedness of experience, maybe is a better word. That our experience of the world or experience in general is always sort of like we talked about those sort of anticipatory structures of experience that when I see the code I already anticipate that I can pick it up and it won't be too heavy for me, that it will be flexible, that it will have a certain texture and so on. There's this sort of basic perceptual anticipation, but there's also all sorts of references or my perceptual situation, my experience already points towards all these other things, that like a coat is something that you would wear in a certain social setting and not in others. For example, you already by recognizing the coat as a certain kind of coat or as my coat for this setting, we already are situating it in relation to where it would be appropriate to wear this coat and where it would not be appropriate to wear this coat. And so my experience of the coat already sort of points beyond even like a strictly psychological level to a kind of sociological level of like what kinds of clothing are appropriate for different social settings, for instance, and that affective relationship that we talked about is also tied up with maybe an economic valuation of that coat. Is it something I spent $1,000 on, or is it something I spent $3 on? And I'm going to treat the coat differently and experience the coat differently depending on that. So I think this sort of open-endedness of experience is something that he's going to talk about in other books, and what it sort of leads to is this sort of inexhaustibility of experience, that you can't ever sort of grasp everything about your experience explicitly and sort of set it all out and say, here's the sort of exhaustive description of my experience. You can always delve deeper into some aspect or explore further some other aspect of your experience that you haven't explored yet. And this is, so it's in this sense that we, that experience is sort of the center of everything else, because it always, it's always on the basis of experience or out of experience that we sort of find these other arenas to explore, that like, looking into what social relationships this code is connected to, economic, whatever, potentially a religious connotation of this code, for example. All these different things could play a role in my experience that I don't grasp clearly now, but that I could explore and have a better grasp of later. Yeah, this is an interesting comment from Angus that I think sort of grasps or points towards what Merleau Ponty is going to develop in later works, not so much in this one, or maybe just sort of in anticipation in this one, but this idea that like there's this sort of this sort of inexhaustible being of the world that is revealed in experience only dynamically. So it's only by sort of exploring my experience that I can come to grasp some element of it, some aspect of it, and then only sort of only over time that I sort of get a better and better grasp of that experience, of what is already implicit in my experience. And so like all these different aspects of the world would all be sort of there implicitly and come to reveal themselves only over time as I learn more, as I explore that experience, and as it sort of develops. And so this connection with Marx is an interesting one. Merleau Ponty has some texts that are about Marx or Marxism, which I don't think I've read, but I think like part of like one element, this fact that like as you experience, as you perceive the code, you perceive it as valuable or lacking in value. That's part of your perception of something as a code, is precisely that sort of commodity function of the object. The one coat is 12 yards of linen or whatever. That you already like the whether this is a valuable or a worthless coat is part of how you experience it as a coat. And this is already sort of pointing towards these exchange relationships and all the other economic structures that go into making something a valuable or a worthless coat. Yeah, and I think here the relationship between concept and well, not exactly intuition. Merleau-Ponty doesn't use the word intuition here, but like conceptual and non-conceptual is a little bit different than for Kant, because for Merleau-Ponty there's this I don't know, explicitating relationship between concepts and perceptions, in the sense that you like when you grasp an object under a concept, when you say this is a code in front of me, I use my concept of code. I'm sort of making a certain element or a certain aspect of that perception explicit for myself, or when I speak and use the word code, I'm making it explicit for someone else. And I'm in doing so, I'm taking something that was implicit in my perceptual experience and making it explicit. And I don't think for Merleau-Ponty there's like some element of experience that can never be conceptualized in the way that for Kant there's this sort of disjunction between matter and form in our experience. I think the idea here is that we can always sort of explore our experience and develop better concepts that make certain elements or certain aspects of that experience more explicit, and we can always keep doing this and develop new concepts, improve our existing concepts, etc. And there's no sort of limit to this process, but at the same time we can't sort of exhaustively conceptualize everything given in experience. So we can always do better or do more, but we can never sort of exhaust experience in terms of concepts. So it's a little bit of a different relationship compared to Kant between conceptual and non-conceptual aspects of experience, I think. Yeah, and in relation to this like sort of economic side of things, like who I am like in relation to an economic structure will sort of color my perception of that code or whatever the object is. Like if I'm a multimillionaire, the coat that cost $100 might look sort of shabby and like not that good to me. It just seems like, yeah, it's I can buy a much better coat, so this coat is not really something that I value. Whereas someone who is like just getting by, that $100 coat might look like this is too expensive for me. This is something I can't afford. Something really valuable. So like, yeah, your sort of basic relationship to the economic structure of a society can affect like how you perceive that code. And again, this is not something that would be sort of secondarily applied after I recognize this is a code from brand X. It would be, by virtue of perceiving it as a code of brand X, I'm at the same time perceiving it as too expensive for me, or as like, too cheap for me. So this is like, yeah, already in our perception of the code as a code of this kind, I'm perceiving it in relation to where I find myself in the economic structure of that society. So are there any other comments or questions on what we've read so far? I'm going to suggest we don't start the next bit today and save that for next time, but if there's we still have a bit of time if anyone has other points they wanted to discuss.
I was reading something about this earlier today that argues that Merleau-Ponty does a kind of phenomenological reduction through like reflex theory. So rather than sort of presupposing, or rather than just sort of doing the reduction, kind of arguing for its necessity after the fact, he's trying to show how considerations of from within reflex theory themselves lead to, as I think we've been talking about, this this pluralistic structural like determination of appearance. I don't know. That was kind of an interesting argument. I don't know if that's sort of what he explicitly set out to do, but maybe the argument so far in the book has had that effect anyway.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about this book in relation to the phenomenological reduction, because he, as far as I remember, even later in the book, he doesn't use that term at all. He does talk about Husserl later in the book, but I don't think he says, like, we're doing the phenomenological reduction here, which is quite different than Husserl's ideas, for example, where like the phenomenological reduction is one of the first steps in the whole process. I think you're right that he, whether we want to say that he is sort of doing it through this criticism of the physiological approach to perception, I think it's correct to say that he is much less sort of direct about the phenomenological reduction than Husserl is, in the sense that for Husserl, we sort of, almost by a sort of pure willpower, we sort of introduce this distinction, or we introduce this reduction process. We sort of bracket our positing of a world as the object of experience, and this is sort of a decision that we have to perform this act at the start of philosophy. And yeah, there's also those other bits about how, the reduction is never complete, and it's something that we always have to do more or better. But at the same time, there's this sort of decisional aspect to it. It's something that we have to decide to do at the outset of philosophy. Whereas for Merleau-Ponty, I think for him, there's a kind of motivation for it from within science, in particular physiology of perception, that like if you start from the scientific literature and you have this critical analysis of the concepts that are being used, you are already led to this notion of experience as such, that is not sort of subordinated to a presupposed positing of a real world behind experience. So yeah, it's a different approach to getting this like experience as such, kind of as an object of philosophizing. I think in Phenomenology Perception, in the introduction, if I remember correctly, he talks a little bit about the phenomenological reduction and like what exactly it means and so on. But I, again, don't really remember in detail how he situates himself in relation to Husserl in that text. Right. Okay. So yeah, maybe we can end here for today and pick up on the next section. It should be next week. So thanks everyone for your participation, your questions and comments. I think it was a really good discussion today. Hope to see you next week.